Welcome to the panel. Welcome to the panel about post-release and reentry. I'm Michelle Morales, the president of Woods Fund Chicago, and it's my pleasure to introduce you to and welcome our panelists for today's discussion. Thank you to all of you for making the time today to be here to the panelists. After the introductions are made, I will outline the issue that we're here to discuss, and then each panelist will offer their reflections, and then we'll commence with our discussion. So just to kick off the introductions, let's please welcome Audra Wilson, Shriver Center's new CEO, or Shriver's Institute, because I think the name changed, new CEO, Brian Harrington, formerly incarcerated youth, Rob Jeffries, the director of the Illinois Department of Corrections, Quinn Rallins, director of the Justice, Equity, and Opportunity Initiative for the Lieutenant Governor, and Victor Dickson, president of the Safer Foundation. One note, Illinois State Representative Jehan Gordon-Booth was supposed to be with us here today, but unfortunately this morning we found out that she had a family emergency and so will not be able to join the panel today. And so just to offer a quick description about what we will be discussing today, since mid-May, the number of prisoners infected nationwide has more than doubled to 68,000. Prison deaths have risen by nearly 75%, and the 5 largest clusters of COVID-19 are prisons and jails. As the pandemic spread through Illinois, for instance, public health concerns caused law enforcement to consider the frequency and necessity of arrests. Some significant criminal justice reforms already in progress were accelerated, while others were stopped. And still, other parts of the system remain untouched by any change. The underlying racism in the system was exposed, but it has not been universally acknowledged. As the number of people released from prisons and jails due to health concerns has increased, the lack of reentry services for this population has been further exposed, bringing light to the systemic barriers that those reentering must combat. For example, in order to be released, people in prison must stipulate where they will be housed and must comply with a series of conditions of release, sometimes averaging up to 15 requirements. Immediately upon release, formerly incarcerated people are monitored for compliance. Securing basic needs like housing and employment can pose major difficulties due to the stigma of having a prison record and the hundreds of laws and regulations restricting access to these resources for people with criminal records. Some might say legal discrimination. This panel will consider the effects of the current reentry experience during the pandemic and discuss how we can successfully improve the system to address the needs and interests of all formerly incarcerated people. This event aims to create a space where those responsible for administering such systems, along with those working to reform them, can consider the path forward for our justice system from this moment. We can learn from recent events, assess how we have responded, and consider what might be done differently as a result. So panelists, each of you will have 5 minutes to share your reflections on these remarks. I will gently remind you when you have 1 minute left. I'll actually kind of cut in and interrupt because I know it's hard to watch the chat box. And we'll kind of go in the order of introductions. So let's start with Audra.
Good afternoon. Again, my name is Audra Wilson. I'm the president and CEO of the Shriver Center on Poverty Law. We just went through a renaming, so that's us for right now, the Shriver Center on Poverty Law. So for over 50 years, the Shriver Center has fought for economic justice and now racial justice. We've secured hundreds of victories with and for people living in poverty in Illinois and across the country. So this is a very timely discussion and something that we have been, as an organization, been talking about perennially, quite frankly. We know that statistics have routinely shown that the vast majority of individuals who have been incarcerated will return home to their communities. And unfortunately, so many are returning to communities that have been woefully under-resourced, which certainly does not fare well for successful reintegration. And it's so counterintuitive to think that about the number of barriers that are put in place to enabling returning citizens to reestablish themselves and reintegrate into their own communities. Barriers to receiving gainful employment, affordable housing, just to be able to live as citizens. And so this is an integral part of the work that we do at the Shriver Center now. We have actually more recently taken this mantle of looking at uh, community justice and criminal justice reform, and specifically looking at reducing the number of people who are entering the system, advocating for less punitive systems, and for advocating for people to lead successful lives after system involvement. We're also looking to, as an organization, to advocate for less punitive systems and also for successful lives after system involvement. So that is what our motivation has been now through our community justice work. So for many, even before COVID-19, living with family has offered some of the most affordable, stable, and commonly used housing options, because one of obviously the biggest barriers for individuals who are returning is finding affordable housing. And in the midst of a pandemic, it is critical to make this a viable option for protecting the safety of individuals, families, and their communities. Now we know through the implementation of a statewide stay-at-home order and the continued insistence that we limit our public interactions has demonstrated that clear consensus that home is the safest place for people to protect themselves and their families. So fortunately, state leaders have recognized that prisons and jails present significant public health risks to individuals who are currently incarcerated. And so that is why it was very important that we were pushing to make sure that people who could be released early were released. But the question is, where do these men and women live upon their release? And that is more urgent now than ever. What sort of supportive services are they able to engage upon their release? And how do we remove those barriers and those impediments to successful reintegration into the communities? So these are among the many questions that we are working on as an organization, and like I said, working with our peers, many of whom are on the phone, and the things that have to be front and center now in our current discussions, especially as we're talking about solidifying our communities.
Wow, you came in under 4 minutes. Anyway, I'm always,
I'm trying to keep it brief.
Thanks.
I've got a lot to say, but I figured we've got plenty of time.
So Brian, we're going to pass it to you. So 5 minutes, and then just a reminder, I'll kind of cut in and remind you when you got about 1 minute left, okay? And make sure you unmute yourself.
Well, my name is Brian Harrington. I'm here on behalf of incarcerated youth. I do a lot of work in juvenile justice, bringing awareness to the state that the juvenile justice system is currently in, and also providing advocacy for criminal justice and all. I'm also here to share my personal experience and give personal testament to the lack of resources that I'm currently faced with as being a COVID release, if you will, who just came home in the midst of all of this. I think that it's important that we definitely turn on more resources for individuals that's coming home right now. Not only financially, because like y'all said, like we got to come home and we got to live with a family member 9 out of 10 of the time, but we still got to eat. You know what I'm saying? We still got to get a job, which is already hard for individuals to find a job at this moment. So I think it's important that we highlight that. Also, aspect that I hope that we get to build on is the mental health aspect of this whole thing, right? Because we're being released in a time where a lot of people are going through it mentally, because we're dealing with things that we never had to deal with as a society due to this COVID-19 situation. I think that mental health is something that's not being shown any interest in when it comes to individuals that's coming home. Like I was given a mandatory anger management stipulation, also a substance abuse stipulation, both of which, if had anybody did any research, I needed now one of them, because I was incarcerated since the age of 14. I didn't have a substance abuse problem when I came, during my incarceration, but yet I still had to go through. Anger management, didn't get to not one fight. So if they would have, I feel like if they would have made me do something that would have benefited me, you know what I'm saying, that would have been more helpful. So I think that we definitely should talk about that aspect of rehabilitation. That is a continuing thing. Not just because my sentence was completed doesn't mean that I'm corrected, because as we know, the institutions, they lack that right now. They lack the rehabilitation aspect of corrections. You know, the Department of Corrections doesn't do too much when it comes to rehabilitation. So I think that I'm here to touch on that.
So Director Jeffries, you're up next.
So hello all, and thank you, Illinois Justice Project, for having me part of this panel. I'm happy that IDLC is at the table to have this meaningful and purposeful conversation as it relates to reentry, and a number of other things I'm sure we're going to get into. And so reentry is something that is new for Illinois Department of Corrections. I've been here all of a year and 1 month and 24 days in counting. And that is one of the areas that we have conversations with about how we can improve people's outcome when they're being released back out to society. So as of when I first got here in June, there was no reentry division. And so since then, we've created a reentry division, and I've put an administrator in charge of all of our reentry efforts to streamline our process for those offenders released in our custody. Her name is Jennifer Perrick, and I'm sure everybody on this phone will probably have some time to speak with her as she moves forward. This is a daunting task, and nothing that has become very, revealing at this time of COVID, because we had to work expeditiously to get folks out. And as we've all talked about in further discussion in this panel is, we saw there's a lack of resources and pathways for folks when they leave this particular agency. And so that's why I think this is so meaningful and purposeful to be at this particular time to have this conversation with these people on this line. I mean, on this phone, on this computer. Just a little bit about some of the things that we have done, just real quick. I don't want to get too far into it, is in realizing that the resources, the lack of resources, the lack of placement, the lack of transitioning housing, the duration of transitional housing, we saw a real particular need to increase that amount of time, not from 90 days. You can't do nothing in 90 days when you get out of the IDLC. So we've increased that to 120 days, at least during this pandemic and everything. And we'll talk a little bit more about some of our release mechanisms. And let's keep in mind that a landing spot and resources is the foundation for somebody to be successful once they get released from incarceration. Not to mention the stigma. Now, I can remember when we were showing all of our numbers as our release numbers and what for. I mean, there's this whole stigma that also comes along. So people have to be more acceptable to people coming out of prison as well too. It sickens me to hear you can let those folks out, but not these folks. And we can get into a little bit more than that, because there's just a whole category of certain subcategories of people that people have this bias against, that they just should not be released for whatever reason, not in my neighborhood or not my county or what have you. So that type of stigma, that type of conversation, and be quite honest, some legislation change needs to happen as well too, because sometimes it's a conversation ain't gonna mean it. We need to force feed folks to start accepting certain individuals coming back outside to society. And I'll leave with this. I'll give you more time because I know Victor's going to take a whole lot of time. We are servants, everybody, and we have a job to do. As difficult as this criminal justice system reform is, we have to have those tough conversations. They have to be meaningful, they have to be action driven, and they have to have outcomes. But we can't have folks just wanting to be the most relevant person in the room all the time and pointing fingers back and forth about who's not doing what and who's doing more than what. And that's just divisive. And you see it as the more people we let out, how many people say, not that group, or you're not letting up that group out. Let's just have a sensible conversation. We can talk about the issues, but we all have to be on the same page as when it comes to resolutions moving forward. We are committed. This is a new division for us. Jennifer Perrick is very excited about it, and we have been doing a lot of work to be done. But we have been doing a lot of work under this on the response to this COVID, because this COVID has just changed the game as it relates to how prisons are being ran and how folks are being, housed and how people are being released. It's very revealing at this particular time in our life. So I'll pass.
Great, thank you. And I just to let everyone know, Representative Gordon Booth is actually going to join us today. She'll be on the panel until 2:30. So obviously, once she'll be the last one to give her remarks, and then I'll introduce her then. So she's supposed to hop on at any moment. Quinn, we're going to pass it to you for your reflections.
Great. Good afternoon, everyone. And I especially want to say thank you, Brian, for sharing your story. A few months ago, before COVID started, the Lieutenant Governor and I got a chance to go out to Kane County to visit their jail. And like we traditionally do, we sit in circle with folks who've been impacted. And it's always a story that resonates with me. During this particular visit, there was a young man who had been there before, and it was clear that, based on his sentence, he was ultimately about to go to the Department of Corrections. And he shared a story about his previous experiences coming home. He would come back into the city of Chicago, and he explained that commute. And he said, Quinn, one of the most painful feelings of my life is traveling back into the city and seeing that skyline. And it was a weird comment for me because, I love that skyline. I remember, coming back from college, from Atlanta, and, flying in and seeing it. It was always something special for me. But he talked about consistently coming back into the city from reentry and having little to no opportunity. He would go to the same location. He mentioned the location in terms of a halfway house, and he mentioned the conditions there. And he said every time he came back to the city, it made him sick to his stomach. And, that conversation resonates with me when we talk about the types of resources that are needed. And this is something the director continuously preaches. When we came in, we did an assessment with the Department of Corrections. I think even before the director got there, just in terms of housing, which really gets to what this man was talking to me about in terms of what he came back to. I think the state was, putting maybe $7 million into transitional housing, maybe for about 3,000 people. The state of Ohio puts nearly, I think $53 million to support nearly 20,000 people. So it's been something that has been eating away at us, and I think that we've really started to dig into the crates over the last few months. So I just shared something that, has been happening behind the scenes. When our COVID funds came through, to some of our agencies, it could have gone to a range of different places, frankly. It could have gone towards, overtime for law enforcement, et cetera. And I think there was an article recently about, how the state has shifted some of its strategies to really dealing with some of the most vulnerable folks. And what we did was we decided, nearly about $30 million is going towards reentry. Some of it is going to flow through our Department of Corrections. Some of it is going to flow through our Department of Juvenile Justice. And, nearly $10 million is going directly to community-based organizations that may have a different theory of how they want to use those funds, but it's going towards housing mainly and transitional supportive services. And the reason I like that is because this is not done in the state. And you have to have a lot of good people who are committed to setting the table in an equitable way for that to happen. Because too often, traditionally, that money's earmarked very, very quickly for certain things that really don't get us out of the rut that we're in. I want to share another example is, when I think about reentry and the way our folks are healing, and this is really coming from the spirit of one of my staff members, Yaakov Delaney, who did 20 years in the Department of Corrections, and it's really been thinking about how we do restorative justice work for people who are returning. How do we ensure that there's opportunities for folks who have done harm to reconnect with their communities, reconnect with victims, reconnect so they can begin to repair that harm and heal themselves. But one of the things we're working on right now with our Department of Human Services, and it's also money that's flowing through COVID, is a few $1 million that the governor put into the budget to do racial healing and restorative justice work. And, you know, one of the things that can be used for is to support folks who are coming home in partnership with some of our agencies so that, you know, as folks transition back into society, and we know there are going to be hurdles, that we start to deal with the challenges, not in a punitive way, but in a way that communities can solve their own problems and repairing that harm. So these are some of the ways that we are dealing with this. And lastly, I just want to say, I know Representative Jehan Gordon-Booth is going to be joining us if she hasn't already, but she's been one of the key champions, and Sharon mentioned this earlier, about how we reinvest money from the cannabis tax fund. So we got appropriated about $45 million. We're expecting to give out $35 million over the next, few months. But that can be used for reentry. And the key thing I want to say is that we weren't prescriptive to communities about what that funds could be used for in terms of, for example, reentry, because what the Lieutenant Governor always says, we need to start really practicing the fact that the wisdom is in the room. And there are plenty of innovative ideas around reentry that communities have that we want to fund, be supportive of, and test often for the first time in this state. So we're excited about, starting to, repair the harm that, frankly, government has done historically.
I was going to tell you have a minute left. Are you good?
I know Victor speaks a long time, so we want to.
Okay. All right. So Victor, you're up next, and Representative Gordon-Booth, we're going to have you go last. Thank you so much for joining us today. We understand that you had a family emergency, so we're deeply appreciative that you're still able to be here today.
And I would just say, Representative Gordon-Booth, if you want to go now, I will defer to you. Okay. Well, it's good to see you, and I echo what Quinn said about your being a champion of this work, and we really certainly appreciate everything you did trying to get that cannabis legislation passed and making sure that it had the restore and renew and rejuvenate, revitalize language in it and the funding. So thank you so much. I want to thank the Illinois Justice Project as well for this convening. Certainly, Michelle, thank you so much for moderating. And thanks to the other folks that are speaking. Director Jeffries, I will try and be as brief as possible. But we at Safer Foundation have been doing reentry work for almost 50 years now. And our organization was doing this work kind of before so many other parties were involved, and so much focus was on this work even before mass incarceration. So we've had a history of being focused on what our end game is helping people become self-sufficient so they can care for themselves, care for their families, have their own income, their own resources, their own housing, and break the cycle of going in and out of jail and prison, which is something that is very much connected to the reduction of crime and violence. That's top of mind right now, but if a person doesn't recidivate, that means they haven't been arrested for any violation of a parole requirement or for a new crime, and that's very important. During COVID, about half of our organization continued to work as essential workers, many of them in the adult transition centers that we operate on behalf of the Department of Corrections. So we were fortunate with direction from corrections in terms of how to begin to implement the health and safety procedures within those facilities. I think that's worked out really well, and as other organizations have done. We shut down our community offices in Illinois and Iowa, but we very quickly converted over to providing virtual services. Fortunately for us, we'd already invested in a lot of the technology, had that in place, and it wasn't a very difficult transition. We actually implemented telehealth behavioral health services so we could continue doing our counseling and drug counseling and treatment services, both inside our adult transition centers and also in the community. And then in response to the effort to release people from prison, we basically formed a coalition of local service providers. We have about 8 different organizations that work together to really help people coming back to Cook County from state prisons. And we've served, I think right now, about over 500 people that we've been working with. And we've been really trying to put together a very holistic model to triage their needs, do some assessment, really look at how we can help them with food and clothing, medicine, getting their state ID card, getting re-enrolled in Medicaid, SNAP enrollment if they are eligible for that, getting them into substance use treatment, mental health treatment, connecting them with physical health resources. Many of them have chronic diseases that make them a lot more susceptible to COVID. So that's been important. And you've heard about housing, transportation. And one of the things in this virtual environment, we've been providing them cell phones with data plans because we are depending on the technology to work with people. We were delighted that AT&T donated cell phones to us and service plans so we can do that. So digital literacy has become really important to help people because of all the virtual services. We're very excited about that work, and that work is continuing. I think the one thing that sticks out to me about COVID more than anything, obviously it's brought to the surface needs that existed anyway. The needs of people released early due to COVID are no different than the needs of people that were released because they fulfilled their sentence. I mean, what happens to them day one, the needs that they have across a broad range of areas is absolutely no different. And so I'm excited about the potential for us to continue this work, make this kind of triage work. We called it the Prison Emergency Early Relief Response Team is what we called it, but to continue that work because it's needed for anybody coming out of prison or jail. The other thing I would say is I hope we don't miss this moment. The people that were released early were not considered to be a threat to public safety. The people that are not being arrested and not being detained in jails, local jails, they're not being detained because they're not considered a threat to public safety. I hope we never go back. Those people that we've deemed being appropriate to be out in the community, we should never go back. They should not be incarcerated. They should not be arrested. They should never be detained. They should not be in the system. We've proven that we don't have to do things that way. Let's not go back. So hopefully I didn't take 5 minutes.
You ended right on time. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And Representative Gordon Booth, thank you so much for joining us. What I'm doing, everyone has about 5 minutes to share their reflections on the topic of the day, obviously reentry and systemic barriers, particularly in general, but how they were highlighted during COVID. And then at the 1 minute left mark, I will gently interrupt.
Okay, thank you. Thank you everybody for being in this space this afternoon. I want to thank the Illinois Justice Project for creating this convening to have much needed conversation at this moment in time, and to all the leadership on the call. I look to many of you regularly in this work, and so I appreciate all of the support that you have been able to not only provide myself, but also members of the Illinois Legislative Black Caucus to help facilitate the work that we do in this space. What I would say that when I think about COVID and where COVID has led us to, it really piggybacks on a lot of what I heard Quinn and Victor already illustrate, and that is the fact that this space has shown us that there's a different way to do things. And we have been doing things in the way that we've done them, and all of us, this isn't new conversation for us. CGLA has always been at the front of the line in terms of fighting for these issues. Safer Foundation, front of the line. The Lieutenant Governor's office has never been the Lieutenant Governor's office that we have now, and thank God for them and their leadership of Juliana and of Quinn, and just being unabashedly Black and proud and willing to defend and fight for justice. I've been in this work as an actual legislator for 11 years, and it's never quite felt like it feels now. It's not that the voices are shifting. It's just that now the ears that are listening are a little bit bigger. And what COVID has done, COVID has forced people that are part of the system, that protect the system, it has forced them to look at the system differently. And we've been able to make some shifts as it relates to policy changes in terms of, as Victor has already illustrated, but we've also been able to shift how money is spent. And because of COVID and the subsequent unrest following the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, it really has given all of us in this space a lot more room than we have had before. And I think that one of the things that we have to continue to do is build on the things that we've been able to do in the last 2 to 3 months, and as it relates to demanding that the process show up for people in a humane way. And I think that for a very long time, even those that were on the side of justice per se, they may have viewed themselves as allies in this fight and in this work, but certainly weren't willing to put themselves out there or to take a risk. That has shifted in this. COVID has created an environment where folks had to pick a side, right? And I think that we have seen that folks have been forced to show up differently, and the sky hasn't fallen. You know, communities have issues, but communities had issues when all of these individuals were incarcerated. I remember back about 2 months ago, you know, we were particularly, and I'm in Peoria, Illinois, so I'm not in Chicago. We were having conversations about, you know, getting people released, and it was amazing when I'm picking up the phone and calling around, trying to figure out housing for folks, not just in the city, but also in downstate, figuring out where folks could be placed. And as I'm going about this work and making phone calls to different folks, in my mind, I thought to myself, why hasn't this always been happening? Why is this only happening as a result of COVID? As a result of COVID, folks are not only being released, but we are looking at how where they go, right? So these are the kind of questions that were then being put on the table. So things that were being said, if we release people, well, where are people gonna go? Where did they go before? These are the kinds of things that the system wasn't asking. This is not to you, Rob, because I know you're in this space with us. But historically, folks never cared where people went. Folks were asking questions like, well, we're just gonna send people home and unemployment is high and nobody is working. Well, in our communities, unemployment has always been in double digits. But now we're concerned about where people are going to work, how they're going to be able to access services. And so trust me, I'm going to remind folks that these are the kinds of conversations that we were having amidst COVID, and these are going to be the kinds of conversations that we're going to continue to have. This space, this galvanizing of the minds, this is such a powerful place for us to be able to operate from, because we all have the areas in which we have really leaned in over the years and have a level of expertise, and we all have the ability to continue to work together, which is why I'm so grateful that the Illinois Justice Project has brought us all together to be able to hopefully remain connected throughout this process, because we are coming upon a veto session this fall. We're coming upon a lame duck session in January. And I would say the biggest thing that I see coming out of COVID and the unrest is the ability in this space to do profound transformational work in our communities that the folks on this call, we've always known was necessary. But I see, to Victor's point, is we have a window. We have a very small window. This is a moment that we can actualize change. I think about this all the time, and it makes me emotional. But there are things that we have the ability to do now that folks that have served in my capacity for decades never had a window to do before. Never. It just was not possible because of the way that the system operated. And when I say the system, I'm talking about all of the players in the system, from the top to the bottom. We're now having conversations with colleagues who consistently vote against the most low-level criminal justice reform bills that are now feeling compelled to want to do something. And so we want them to stay in that place, and we want to give them something. And so I look forward to being able to work with all of you and in helping us to craft this agenda that we're going to be pushing forward on. When we think about how we ended up in this place of seeing, none of this was news to us, but what COVID was able to reveal for many folks who had just been going along their merry way and, thought that all of us that have these conversations, that we're always, barking at the moon, so to speak. All of a sudden, because of COVID, people were trapped in their homes. They were forced to hear CNN or MSNBC night after night talk about the disproportionate nature by which COVID was attacking our community. And it was doing that not because we were made more inferior to anyone else, but it is because folks in our community, we are the essential workers. We are the folks that are consistently out there. When many of us on this call had the ability
30
to have
seconds,
the privilege
Representative.
to work from home, many of our folks in our community did not. And then you layer that with what happened after May 29th, after the murder of George Floyd, and folks being stuck in their homes and having to watch that. It has created a very real moment for us to actualize massive change, to be able to really try to deal with much of the systemic racism that is built into government. And I look forward to embarking on that work with not only my colleagues, but with you as well.
Thank you all so much for your reflections on today's topic at hand. Just to frame and just to remind the public that is watching that 24,000 individuals re-enter the prison system every single year. So wanted to put a number to whenever we talk about re-entry, we talk about people coming back into prison. It's about 24,000 a year. And so to everyone on the panel, and we're trying to craft this as a conversation. So sometimes I will ask people certain questions, but please also jump in if you have thoughts or remarks. But this one's for everybody. The rapid decarceration, and I apologize for the barking dog in the background, of people from prisons and jails underscore the absence, right? All of you have mentioned this, the absence of a reentry infrastructure, right? Not piecemealed programs or anything like that, but an actual infrastructure, right? It's manifested in the inability to find stable housing and meet other reentry requirements, which prevent many from release. So how can we make sure that, how can we ensure that a lack of stable housing does not extend time in prison for individuals, nor prevent families from housing those who return due to their own financial insecurity and housing instability? So, something that was mentioned earlier, I think it was Director Jeffries, that knowing that landing somewhere helps with successful reentry. How though can we ensure that when we know there's a combination, that there's poverty, right? And people may not have financial security and may not have financial stability. Does that prevent people from releasing? And then what are the conversations being had around preventing that from happening? Who would like to tackle that first? I can assign someone to it. Audra, you want to take a stab at whatever Shriver has been working on in that? Or Victor, was that you?
Well, I would just say that I think you've pointed out that housing is a big issue for people. Obviously, everybody that was released during COVID had to have housing already in place in order to be released, because I believe, Director, that's one of the requirements of being released is to have housing. So the issue that we tried to deal with was the fact that people come home, you know, the majority of people that are incarcerated were living below the poverty level before they were incarcerated. And their family income drops 22% while they're incarcerated. They'll earn 40% less for the rest of their life because they have a record. So they're coming home, but they may be coming to a family that's already struggling. So it was important for us to jump in and say, how can we get them some cash? How can we give them food? How can we give them clothing? How can we help them so they're not a burden to the family that they are going into? Because then maybe they can be a bit more stable in that housing, because housing falls apart pretty quickly after someone is there for a while. They have no income, they have no job, etc. So that was very important. I think the other important thing is expanding the amount of housing. As the director mentioned, they've increased the amount of time people can be in transitional housing. That's very important. But expanding the housing stock, and also creating more housing that is not tied to having a serious mental health diagnosis, or, you know, some housing is out there, but you couldn't have been incarcerated within the last 3 months, or you don't qualify to go into that housing. So we need housing, a broader set of housing options, and more availability of transitional housing for longer periods of time.
Good question, and something that we are working here in IDOC, along with the Lieutenant Governor's office and the Safer Foundation as well, is the resources. I mean, we talk a lot about housing, but the sustainability of that housing, once they get out of that transitional housing, starts with employment. And so a lot of times we have a whole lot of, you know, employers are not readily accessible, readily to employ folks who are returning back to society because of the stigma. But there's also things that we can partner with other state agencies to help give them tangibles when they walk out the door. I mean, Victor touched on it about when we was doing the peers with him, about folks need to be able to land, hit the ground, and be able to have a place to go to get some quick mental health needs, some substance abuse needs, some SNAPs, anything that can help put clothes on their back, and anything, you know, just to keep them sustainable and keep some type of, you know, nobody wants to be asked for help. So if we can make it available for everybody, and then it kind of releases that whole stigma about I'm coming out, starting fresh, and what have you. But this is what we're doing to assist you. The transitional housing, I can't say enough about that. So one of the things that we're going to be doing here for IDOC, I'll be remiss if I don't speak on this, about a $9 million grant that we have as it relates to housing. You know, there is so much opportunity and so much work to be done, because it's easy to accept those individuals coming out who are nonviolent, but it's harder to accept those ones who need the most need, and that deals with the mental health population. I think Brian touched on it a little bit, but some of our housing, this grant that we have, this $9 million, are going to address some of the substance abuse needs. We're going to address some of the mental health needs. You know what? We also need to have that harder conversation about those individuals with sex offenses as well too. We got too many stipulations on people as they're being released. You can let that person out, but not this person. We will take this person, but not that person. So those are those hard conversations, but they're purposeful conversations. And those are the type of things that we need to talk about. Legislation as well too. There is so many statutes as to where somebody can live and they can't live once they're being released. There's just a number of things that we can all do collectively, not just this panel, but everybody else listening, about how we can move this, you know, seize the moment, as Representative has spoke about. Seize this moment right now, because no better time than everybody's so laser focused on the needs at hand. And this is the opportunity to be able to get some things done. I promise you, we're going to work. We're going to be at the table in every discussion there is possible. And matter of fact, we're going to try to lead some of these conversations about some of the things that can be done to help. Because we have the population. We know what's needed. We know where we struggle at. We got 1,200 individuals, and I'll be brief with this one. We have 1,200 individuals that are on the MSR date still incarcerated because we can't find housing placement because of statutory requirements or statutory limitations in which they cannot go. And those are sex offenders. And a lot of those 1,200 are also seriously mentally ill, essentially mentally ill. Those are those hard conversations. Those are hard conversations.
So Audra, I know you wanted to say something, and then after your remarks, I'm going to ask another question.
Sure. And so obviously following these great folks who are saying such important things, so I don't want to be too repetitive. Although I do think one thing that does bear repeating is Representative's comments about how this is a moment in time. It's something that actually when I first began at Shriver just a month ago, that's one of the things that I had also pointed out, that there are very few times in history that we have these sort of, I call them cultural flashpoints, where we can really, now that people are actually paying attention, that we can start to make some significant change. And I think to her point when saying, well, we were having these conversations before COVID, so why is it so relevant now? I asked myself that very same question, but then the answer is the same. Well, whatever the case, whatever draws people's attention to this is what we're going to take advantage of as advocates, as we all are. Shriver as an organization has obviously been working for over 50 years to fight for people living in poverty in Illinois and across the country. But we do know that so many of our returning citizens are living in these very same communities that are affected. And so that's why a lot of our work has helped to include removing barriers to returning citizens over the years. Now, I am actually an alumnus of the organization. I started my legal career here. So about 16 years ago, or 16 plus years ago, when I was starting to work on these issues, we were talking about removing barriers to licensure so that returning citizens could engage in more entrepreneurial pursuits like being barbers or estheticians and landscapers. And then more contemporarily, we were talking about ban the box legislation and other sorts of initiatives that penalize returning citizens from being able to find gainful employment. And Victor actually has already referenced the fact that people who were previously incarcerated can expect their future earnings to be reduced by about 40%. We were dealing with individuals with lack of continuity from healthcare services that they received while incarcerated to once they are out now, and making sure that there's a proper coordination of that. And we even know that education is directly associated with reducing recidivism. Some statistics have shown up to between 16 and 20% reduction in recidivism when there are educational opportunities that are afforded to returning citizens. But one place, obviously, the lowest hanging fruit is housing. Housing has been a core of the work that we've done at Shriver. It's a core of the discussion that we're having today. One thing that I would say on the housing front is that we need to disentangle housing from the criminal legal system altogether. So there are certain places where we can do this, for example, with tenant screening. So oftentimes landlords who are using a person's record to screen them from housing, and the fact that we need to push back against why that information is even relevant in the first place. We need to be thinking about background check companies. And we have to recognize that the role of background check companies is to convince landlords and other decision makers about the value of a background check and how their business models depend on keeping these systems intact. So when background check companies stood up and actually actively lobbied against the Just Housing Amendment to the Cook County Human Rights Ordinance, they pointed to their bottom line, even after hearing that the personal testimony of the human cost of homelessness after incarceration. So these are some areas that we may not necessarily think of instinctively, but these are areas where people or systems once again are working against those who are trying to reintegrate successfully. And then another place we have to think about is
Audra, just real quickly, because I know Quinn wanted to offer some remarks, and I wanted to let the representative jump in pretty soon because she has to leave in about a couple.
Okay, no, last thing, crime-free and nuisance ordinances. So in Illinois, we see the problem of a crime-free and nuisance ordinances that often force landlords to evict tenants who have been arrested for crimes. And we've challenged municipalities who have used these ordinances to target Black communities to maintain racial segregation. And so these are ordinances essentially weaponize evictions and increase police presence and harm and destabilize Black household and communities. So basically disentangling even the notion of housing from the criminal legal system is something that we are advocating for.
Thank you, Quinn.
Yeah, I'll just jump in. I just want to add a piece about the housing. So we just worked with Illinois Housing Development Authority and Department of Corrections to get out about $4 million for transitional housing, a pilot to rethink about some transitional housing strategies. And initially we were like, how do we bolster this to ensure that folks have what they need? So we're like, how do we have funding to make sure they have utilities paid and furniture? And we were doing this with private housing providers. They said that's fine, but what we really need to know is whether or not there's a commitment to having wraparound services and supportive services. And there was some myths about what DOC historically had been providing, right? They assumed that that was a part of the package, if you will. And, you know, we had to have some intimate conversations, bringing in the Department of Human Services and the Department of Corrections. And ultimately, the bill wasn't written in a way where that was required. And we found ourselves in limbo. Now, I bring this up because Brian made a point. He said there are all these different types of things that are required, but there's been limited services around healthcare. Now, this has been a problem that continues to linger. There are statutes on the books right now. There's a requirement for people to be enrolled in Medicaid coming out of the Department of Corrections that was passed, I think last year. There was a statute requiring folks to be enrolled in the Department of Juvenile Justice a few years ago. And these things continue to sit on the books. So when we talk about this moment, there's an opportunity to move forward with new legislation, but it's also an opportunity to ensure we get legislation that's been passed right. We recently, and I just want to say why this is important, we recently got a system set up within our Department of Juvenile Justice to ensure that every youth who comes out of there is enrolled in Medicaid. And 95% of them have a diagnosable mental health condition, by the way, right? That 95%. And out of all of them that were released within a certain month, within a month, 95% of them had health care in hand. That has not happened historically. So when we talk about the types of supports that the Department of Corrections needs, et cetera, we all need to work with Director Jeffries to ensure that this is happening for the 25,000 people who are leaving the Department of Corrections. Because if they do not leave there with health care in hand, and it happens in other states, then we're going to have significant problems around recidivism and positive outcomes.
Representative Gordon Booth, I know that you have to hop off pretty soon, but I wanted you to give some thoughts around creating this infrastructure. And one of the things that Quinn had mentioned was a pilot program. And I know that many activists and advocates have talked often about how there's a lot of pilot programs, but there never seems to be an infrastructure. And just wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, something that we all know that was again highlighted with COVID was the lack of reentry infrastructure that exists statewide. Typically, when we have issues that we are critically concerned about from the perspective of a legislature, we create centralized processes for those things to ensure that the things that are done in those spaces are done with fidelity and done with a high degree of accountability. That doesn't exist in reentry, and it was further highlighted not just to those of us that engage in this space, but also to individuals who may view themselves as allies of the space, or people who don't care at all. Many of them had to become hyper aware of these issues because of COVID. So, you know, when thinking about what are the things that are needed, number one, you have to have resources, right? And so as we're looking to move into the next budgetary cycle, obviously we have a world of challenges ahead of us if we don't get a major bailout from the federal government. But what we do know, thinking long-term, one way or the other, we know that these issues do not go away because there's a vaccine to COVID. It just simply does not. But really taking this moment to really begin to lean into these issues around the necessity of having a built-in reentry infrastructure that is statewide, that has the ability to facilitate this work around the state. I didn't realize that California has a much better reentry strategy than we do here in Illinois. As we were, again, dealing with some of the issues of COVID and people needing to be released, I had to then rely upon some of my colleagues and comrades out in California to get advice from them on things that we could be doing here in Illinois to have a much better process. And so I'm committing to those of you on this call, but also those that may be watching in YouTube or wherever else that may be. I am committing my time, my energy, and any capital that I may have to spending my time working on this as an issue, because it was more than hurtful to know that you have folks that can come home, that should come home, but because we have not spent the time really building our reentry strategies for folks all over the state, it really shows where the process is as it relates to caring about these men and women. And the other reality is that I believe that many folks look at individuals that become incarcerated, they believe that you just go put those folks away. What they don't realize is 87% of those individuals are coming home. So it matters how you treat them while they're there. That matters. What resources they are being given while they're there. That matters. So all that is pre-reentry. And then when it's time for them to reenter into society, it matters what happens to them upon release. And so I'm looking forward to continuing in this work with new eyes wide open from a lot of the folks that serve in the General Assembly. I would also say that there is a need for us to begin to really be speaking truth to power about the need to drastically change and shift the way that we are spending resources as it relates to the state. You know, we talked a little bit before about R3, and I don't want to put two, because this is not an R3 piece, but I want to give a real quick shout out to Safer and Victor at Safer, Victor and Safer, because they are the ones who actually named R3, Restore, Reinvest, Renew, as we were negotiating cannabis and how we were going to use some of these proceeds to invest back into our communities. There was one name, I think it was ROC. I think it was the ROC program, and we didn't want that. And so in consultation and conversation with Safer, they were the ones that coined R3, Restore, Reinvest. And also I wanted to put that out there for folks that didn't know. But using that context, and looking at the way that we, engage in new industries and how we demand that resources be sent specifically to specific areas, I think that is also something else that we can continue to look at over time, is, doing what we need to do within the budget, but then also every time we are looking at a new industry, we should be looking at the equity spend on how those tax dollars are then being reinvested back into our communities to care for the very things that we care about most. And this certainly, this issue certainly is at the top of the list for me and many others.
Great, thank you so much. A quick question, because this is something that Victor had raised in terms of expanding the housing stock. So Director Jeffries and Quinn, I'm going to throw this at you as representatives of the state, if you will. One thing that came out that advocates were very critical of was the amount of property that CHA had that was vacant and that was not being used to assist, right, in this release process during the pandemic. We all know CHA has many policies that bar those with felonies or electronic monitoring to be on their property. So just wondering, has there been any thoughts of the state applying any pressure on CHA for use of those vacant properties so that more folks can be released? I think one thing we all know is that the mainstream media has not even been covering this issue anymore, right? And we're slowly moving to a society that is starting to believe that the pandemic is over when we're still only in the first wave. So wanted to get your thoughts on that. Either one of you can.
I'm going to defer to
Quinn, he deferred to you.
So not on that specifically. I think that some of the conversations are around public housing, the role of public housing authorities generally. Obviously, right now there's been some innovative things happening in Cook County and the city. Safer Foundation was central to that in terms of thinking about, I think it's the Just Housing Ordinance, in terms of just thinking about how we develop reasonable frameworks around look back period. You know, distinguishing whether or not folks are looking at convictions or arrests. These are things that are not tightened up throughout the state. And one of the conversations we've been having is what does it look like to increasingly enter into deep discussions with our public housing authorities statewide. But the other thing I think, and I want to commend our Illinois Housing Development Authority, is obviously they have a significant role in terms of thinking about our relationship with housing authorities statewide. One of the things that we've been having conversations about is how we use increasing innovative opportunities to support people who have criminal records and people who are coming home. So what does that mean? It means how do we look at the low-income housing tax credits and how those funds are used? What does the community look like? Is there a requirement to have a certain amount of housing units for folks who have criminal records and have, you know, or even returning from the Department of Corrections? So those are the types of discussions that we've been having, but nothing specific around the AD units.
If I could just make a quick comment about the housing, CHA housing. There was a great push by a lot of different organizations, a coalition, to get a pilot going in CHA for people with records to move into housing with their families. And I think that pilot, from what we can tell, has gone very well. And hopefully the CHA would be much more open to expanding the ability for people to move into CHA housing. But also, and we've been the recipient of one of their project-based vouchers, which enables a subsidy for people who have records who are employed to rent apartments subsidized. And that's something that I think if that were expanded as well, would create a great opportunity for people. So there is, I think, a wonderful opportunity to pursue there. One thing I wanted to ask, and I'm curious about, is because of all of the health-related issues with COVID and the justice population, people who are incarcerated, I was wondering if there's any way any of that CARES Act money could be used, either the current money in the state or future money the state gets, to do something like the systems work that needs to happen so that people's Medicaid can be reinstated prior to their release from prison. So by the time they release, they can immediately get connected to the behavioral health resources, mental health resources, have health insurance, get their medications that they need, you know, make sure they have access to Narcan kits and medication assisted treatment, because people overdose more likely within the first 30 days after release from prison. So it seems like that could fit under the category of health related matters, and we could carve out some money. I'd be willing to bet the director would love to have money to upgrade his systems, so that kind of Medicaid reinstatement could be automated. Should be happening once that release planning starts. It should be one of those things that somebody hits a button and it starts that process, and by the time someone releases, it's already in place. So it's a big data systems project, and it seems like, you know, I'm just curious as to why we couldn't take some of that money and make that happen.
So I'll give a little bit of space if anyone knows the answer to that, but just be mindful of time. We have about 10 minutes left, and I did want to get some thoughts from Brian. So does anyone know if CARES Act money can be used for systemic improvements? Okay, I'm gonna take that as a probably we don't know yet. So it could be something, to Victor's point, worth looking into. So Brian, I actually want to get some of your thoughts in here. You know, one thing that's been mentioned throughout everyone's remarks and answers is how resources should be mapped out, right? Resources being mapped out before an individual is released, so they align with what they need. And something that Victor brought up is also the needs of the families as well, right? So wherever the person is returning to. I just want to get your thoughts on your experience with that. Did that happen to you? Were you referred to an organization to help you with your needs? And how did that kind of go for you?
Yeah, well, first, I think that is very, very important that there is things already in place for individuals' families, because the simple fact is, you know, everybody know the saying goes, in prison they given 3 hots in a cot, right? When you come home, you're given to a family, for those that's lucky enough to come home to a family, but you're given to a family that's already struggling to make it. But then you're throwing another grown man onto their bills, into their space. There isn't a bed for him to sleep on, so he's sleeping on the couch. You know what I'm saying? So I think that if they're helped out, because at the end of the day, like, I'm still on MSR. I'm still a part of if I commit a crime right now, however petty, I go back to Illinois Department of Corrections, because I'm still their property but they're not responsible for me financially no more, but my family is. But yet my family don't get that 3 hots in a cot support from the organization as the state will. So yeah, for me, I didn't have any help from no organization. I'm grateful to be on this call to actually hear that Victor and the Safer Foundation. I will be reaching out to that foundation, because I think that first off, for appreciation, and to hopefully for assistance. But there wasn't any organization to help me since I've been home, as far as making sure that I was all right in any aspect, but especially the mental transition of things. I haven't been out here in society since 2007, and I'm just thrown back into society, not to mention during this COVID-19 situation, but there is no one to help me. There's no one to guide me, to make sure everything is going in accordance, to make sure I don't reoffend. In actuality, my personal experience, I even was attacked. I was used by, as a political ploy by the state here in Rockford. The state's attorney, she even said, she went as far as to say, as the rector mentioned earlier, they don't want us in their community. She literally got on local television and said, "Oh, I don't even want him in my community." Right? So how is that mindset? She's giving it to all the business owners, like, we don't want him automatically. So I'm fighting against that stigma just for being here, you know, just for being released. I'm attacked just for being released. And I'm glad that earlier someone mentioned that 87% of the population is coming home, but we're not receptive to that 87%. But then we want to demonize that 87% for when they reoffend, you know. But we're coming home, so let's already have something in place for these individuals that are coming home regardless, and also make sure that while they're incarcerated, that we're investing, because this is the broken link, right? This is the broken link of America that we want to invest in, because if we want America to reflect the desires, reflect the vision that we hope for one day, we got to invest in the broken link. It only makes sense. If I'm thinking wrong, correct me. Right now, y'all just warehousing me. Like, y'all literally just putting me on a shelf and say, do your time, and then you come home. So you want me to come home a 14-year-old boy, in a sense. You know, I did 13 years. You wanted me to come home mentally a 14-year-old boy again. So it's like, there wasn't nothing put in place to help me. Also, I hate that, not hate, but unfortunately, this wasn't a conversation around how the current state of prison. But Director, I definitely will like to ask a quick question. Is there anything in place still about individuals who are trying to basically, because I was given a chance through clemency, but is there anything in place like a parole system or something for the individuals that deserve a second chance, or has been personally rehabilitating itself, and hasn't been in any trouble and just doing dead time, if you will? Like, Is there anything in place to monitor those individuals? Is there something they can file to get to bring awareness to their situation?
Well, thank you, Brian. And so first, let me start with commend you on your courage. I mean, that story right there is the purpose for this type of discussion and our commitment moving forward as it relates to how do we get people better prepared than when they came in the front door. So reentry starts at reception center for us as we move forward. And so that's been our call, and that's been part of our top priority moving forward over this last year. And so now we're coming to the end part when we're talking about reentry. So I commend you for your effort, and best of luck to you. And I'm sure Victor will provide some resources for you. As it relates to the question you presented, there was a lot of things in there. So I'm gonna unpack a little bit at a time. You talked about the grievance system. You talked about the clemency. You talked about parole board, and there was a fifth part. I can't remember what it was. Clemency, that's out of the PRB. And I think I listened to the panel earlier today, and they talked about the parole board has been abolished some years ago. So they have something, what they call the prison review board that looks at individuals. Then the other one was dead time, as it relates to dead time. It's so ironic that you bring up dead time.
Can you explain for the public what that means?
Dead time. So if you have a sentence of 5 years and you under the statute of 50%, you commit an offense through the rules adjustment board inside the facility. We can take, if you only got to do 2.5 years, based on any infraction you do, we can add time to that 2.5 years up to that 5 years. And, you know, we're looking at that right now. And I put out an edict about a month ago, no more dead time taken away from nobody until we have somebody come in and look at how we can give time back to individuals who are past their time of MSR. It's just one of those mechanisms that was afforded to this agency, but with no oversight, as he spoke about the grievance process and what have you. With there's no oversight, you can take it away, but who's monitoring to give it back? And so it's just so ironic that you brought this up, because my chief of staff, as we just talked about this last week, and we have been talking about trying to give some parity across the board. But at this point, moving forward, no one's taking no more time away from anybody until we can get a handle on how that is being done across the board, who's holding accountable and who's monitoring it. I mean, that's just, I mean, especially in this time right now. I mean, I don't want people serving past their time when they can be out when we're trying to deal with social distancing and the pandemic inside of a prison facility. I mean, just, you know, we're shooting ourselves in the foot. So thank you for bringing that up, but those are the type of things that we're looking at. As far as the grievance process, and I'll be real brief with that, we have to create a grievance process to where your concerns, you trust the outcome of that grievance process. Right now, people do not trust it. That's why we have over 3,000 lawsuits, because they don't trust us to handle individuals' grievances, so they go to the outside courts. As you all know on this call, and everybody who's a participant, we have a lot of lawsuits against us. So we have a lot of opportunity to improve the way we function, how we operate, and how our transparency becomes as it relates to our population, and what's best for you and individuals like you coming behind you when they leave here. So those are a couple of things I can answer real quickly. I hope I answer everything, but the PRB, the parole board is not in existence anymore. The PRB has oversight on a number of other type of releases as it relates to clemency and what have you, and refers to the governor.
So we're gonna call it there. It's 2:45. So I know that that's the end of our time together today. I know that Esther and Gary are going to be coming on in a minute to close us out, but just wanted to thank all of the panelists for your time today, for being here today, for sharing your reflections and thoughts and the things you are working on to improve our post-release and reentry system, and to hopefully, as we have been talking about, put an actual infrastructure in place that can support not only those individuals that are reentering into their communities, but their families as well, so that we can see a more successful reentry process in the near future and build upon this historic moment that we're in. So I'll pass it over to Esther and Garion to close us out.
Good afternoon. So first, we want to thank all of our panelists throughout the day, our moderators / responders. This has been a remarkable event, a remarkable set of conversations. And as we think about our next steps forward and we think about how powerful today was, we want to highlight a few things, right? We've heard conversations around accountability, police accountability. We heard a personal testimony from our Attorney General about the first time a policeman pointed a gun at him. We've heard about the need for more accountability for judges on the bench from the top judge in our state, the Chief Justice of the Illinois Supreme Court. We've heard from leadership all across the board about the need for reforms in bond, reforms in relations, reforms in race relations, and a call to action in combining partnerships and power amongst people here, the people who are listening, the people who are at the table, and the decision makers across the state. We should accept these challenges. We should highlight the work that has been done and continue to move the ball forward. We have to continue to push the envelope. We have to continue to push things forward. We have to think about how we take the things that we have learned that have been positive in this time and implement those and keep those going. All right, so as we think about next steps and highlights, I'll turn it over to our co-convener, Esther Franco-Payne. So we'll give it up to Esther now.
Thank you so much, Garion. And I just want to send huge bravos across the airwaves to all of our panelists and our moderators. So we say, what are the next steps from all of this interesting and amazing discussion that we've had here today? So ILJP, Illinois Justice Project, and Cabrini Green Legal Aid, along with our co-conveners, will be working together to create a manifesto. So what's a manifesto, you might ask? A manifesto is a public declaration of policy aims and or published intentions, motives, or views, be it by an individual, group, political party, or government, to promote new ideas with prescriptive notions for carrying out changes the author believes should be made. So that's our key intention, to put out information that will communicate changes that we believe should be made. So this manifesto will serve as a statement of the issues that were discussed today as a result of the 3 panels, as well as the solutions recommended for sustainable reform. It will be made publicly available. And we believe that this will be the foundation for action to ensure that there's true equity and justice for Black and Brown communities and those negatively impacted by the criminal justice system. So what do? We want your participation and the involvement of those who have joined us today. We want you to be champions for the cause. One, by having personal engagement with one another and learning more about the systemic racism within the criminal system and the barriers that people experience every day that prevent them from achieving positive outcomes. 2, by getting involved with your communities as change agents. I think that's easy, and there are plenty of opportunities for that to happen each and every day. And then 3, by demanding that solutions are implemented and that there is accountability for those responsible for making the change. So we've heard from our stakeholders today. We've heard from our elected officials. We've heard from people who run the system. We've heard from people who are impacted by the system. And we need to hold each other accountable for the changes that we hope to see. Together, we are better, and together, we can have collective impact. If you registered through the registration website, you will be our first point of follow-up, as we have already collected your information. Over 600 registrants today, over 60,000 views. That's exciting. Secondly, if you would like to submit comments or suggestions about positive and effective solutions, you can do that by reaching us at info@iljp.org or by submitting comments through the event website at www.iljp.org/justice-2020 comments. And those things will be posted for you either in some kind of chat or following the event. And then lastly, a recording of this event will also be shared through our website for those who missed it. So we will have the recording made available and people can go back and listen, digest the information. It's a lot to process. And from there, you can notate what you see as effective solutions that can be sent to us. So ultimately, we appreciate your participation today. We appreciate the panelists and the moderators for a great discussion. Thanks to all of our co-conveners. I am ever grateful to Illinois Justice Project in joining us in this feat. It's been a tremendous feat to bring this all together. And I am bidding everyone adieu with light and love and to have a safe and peaceful weekend.
Before we bid all the way adieu, it wouldn't be us if we didn't give homework. So check out our bibliography with the materials from today's events. If you want to read up on some things, get some background information about how this came together and why this information is important, take a look at some of that. And with that, now we'll let Esther bid us adieu.
Yes. Have a great and safe weekend, everyone. Thank you, Garion.
Thank you all.